In March of 2006, a working paper was released by Professors John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, entitled The Israeli Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. The paper questioned the United States' unwavering support for Israel, Israel's behavior toward its neighbors, and the influence of the pro-Israel lobby on the United States Congress. Similar to Carter's book, the paper received scathing criticism despite reaching mainstream audiences.
That particular study, in my view, was a farce in so many ways. I mean, it had misfacts. It quoted people completely out of context, and ultimately it was just a long rant about Israel. They threw the kind of whole kitchen sink out there in a very imprecise and unthoughtful way. And it's been criticized on that basis by a lot of very thoughtful people.
When we were first attacked, when our article came out, virtually all of the attacks focused on John and Steve. They did not focus on the substance of our charges. There were no big debates in the mainstream media about whether there is a powerful Israel lobby, whether that lobby is affecting U.S. foreign policy in positive or negative ways, what effect it is having on Israel itself. There's just no debate along those lines in the mainstream media. Instead, the question was, how do John and Steve link up with David Duke? In other words, John and Steve, much like Jimmy Carter more recently, became the focus of attention, not the substantive issues.
The first line of attack was simply to smear us personally, to accuse us of being anti-Semitic, to claim that we'd gotten sources from neo-Nazi websites, which was an absurd charge, and just go after us personally. The problem with that line of criticism is that there was no basis for it, and no one could find anything in our histories that suggested any kind of odd, perverse motive here. The second argument was to basically attack us on a whole series of tiny little charges and suggest that somehow the scholarship, as you had said, was careless or sloppy. Again, if one looks carefully at all of these charges, it just doesn't add up. It also, I think, fails a certain common sense test. It wasn't very credible to think we would suddenly, when taking on this particular highly controversial issue, would suddenly become careless. Quite the contrary, we bent over backwards to make sure we'd gotten things as right as was humanly possible to get them.
We, from the perspective of Jewish organizations, we have to understand that, you know, we want to be influential. We don't think we're influential enough sometimes, and we want to be more influential, and that with that drive is going to come some criticism. Hopefully it's going to be thoughtful criticism and not of the likes of Mearsheimer Walt. We believe that, that the policies that we advocate for are the right policies. They're good for America. They're good for the stability in the Middle East. They're good for democracy, and that we're arguing for what's right for this country. Obviously, there are people who disagree with that, and they can argue. It would be nice, though, if they did so in the spirit of legitimacy. In other words, if they really understood that we were doing what every other group does in this country when they make their position, and not turn it into some diabolical exercise of you know, or conspiracy theory of how Jews are trying to, you know, manipulate the process.
Well, the third thing that critics do, of course, is they just misrepresent your argument. Instead of criticizing what you actually wrote and actually said, they accuse you of saying something you didn't say, or they ignore things that you explicitly said in the paper. Just to give one example, we're frequently criticized for claiming that the Israel lobby, quote, controls U.S. foreign policy. We never said that. In fact, we quite clearly said that it didn't control. It was of important influence, but it doesn't control it. No single factor controls American foreign policy. We were also criticized for portraying the Israel lobby as some kind of conspiracy or some kind of secret cabal, which of course is this old anti-Semitic notion, you know, based on the protocols of the elders of Zion and forgeries like that. We explicitly said several times in the paper, of course, that the Israel lobby was a completely legitimate public operation, an interest group like many other interest groups. But critics simply ignore that because it's easier to try and attack something we didn't say than attack what we actually wrote.
President Carter wanted to do was get people talking about Israeli policy in the occupied territories. And you can have an intelligent debate on that subject. There's no reason that people have to agree with Jimmy Carter when he describes the system in the occupied territories as one of apartheid. But let's at least have the debate. But we didn't have the debate. Instead, what we had was one giant smear campaign against Jimmy Carter, in the same way that what we had against John and Steve in the spring of 2006 was one giant smear campaign. Because when it comes to talking about Israel and the U.S.-Israeli relationship, people are not interested in facts and logic. They're interested in smearing people who make arguments that they don't want to hear.